So the rising of those fundamentalist beliefs, America was part of it, because at that time they were fighting the Russians. They ended up funding those fundamentalists, only later for the same fundamentalists to turn against them. But all in all, we have seen God using America in a very special way, especially in those two areas. And then before that, America also has been leading in the missionary work. It used to be Europe, particularly England and Scandinavians, which kept sending missionaries all over the world. But in the last millennium, America took over from Europe. They were sending 94% of missionaries all over the world, while the rest of the world was only sending 6%. But only recently, Korea has kind of mashed up and risen, sending missionaries all over the world. But in those three areas, America has been really a bulwark against the rise of evil. Now the devil had turned it around the same way Germany was. Germany was the most advanced nation because of the teachings of Martin Luther, because of the education system that embraced the Reformation. Now it ended up becoming very, very, very advanced. And now Satan, through Hitler, started to use Germany in the two world wars to cause havoc instead. And that is exactly the same plan Satan has. First of all, these Islamic nations cannot rise to greatness. Why? Because in their philosophical resources, their theology cannot allow nations to grow. In nations where women are undermined, their rights are not recognized. The Arab nations don't recognize women's rights, they don't acknowledge individual rights. If you don't allow those individual rights to conscience, for example, you cannot worship the way you want if you're in Saudi Arabia and many of these countries. So where those rights are curtailed, nations can't grow to greatness. It is the freedoms, God-given freedoms, which enable a nation to rise to greatness. The rights to associate, the rights to marry who you want, the right to express yourself, right of expression, right of conscience, you worship God the way you want. Those freedoms are very, very important in making a nation great. So in their philosophical resources, theological and philosophical resources, Arab nations cannot grow to greatness. Also, if you don't allow people to be themselves, they cannot innovate. So innovation is not allowed, is not, so the nation cannot grow to that greatness. You can see that's what had hindered China. China had for many years been a great civilization. But when they curtailed these rights and these freedoms, then it stagnated. Now they realized that they needed to free them, to free the population, and you can see a big change taking place at the moment. China has come from so far. In one generation, they have moved 300 million people out of poverty. They're producing, China and India alone are producing 500,000 scientists every year, while in America it's only about 60,000. So you can see why these freedoms are important in building a great nation, because scientists innovate, and then when they innovate, they have laws to protect their innovation, rights to for what we call copyrights. Copyrights are important because when you invent something, it is yours exclusively, and you have a law to protect it, and then you can benefit from it. That's how nations grow. We call it free enterprise. Free enterprise is part and parcel of development. Without it, nations don't grow. If everybody gets the same money and the same pay at the end of the day, whether they are lazy or they are hardworking, what is the motivation for working? Even if I work hard, I will still get the same money as the one who is lazy and sleeping. That's what communism did in Russia and many countries that had been taken over, killing innovation, free enterprise. That's not how God created us. We see that in the parable of the talent, that all of us are given different gifts and we're supposed to develop them, and we're supposed to put our best and then make profit. It is built within us. Free enterprise is built within us. It's part of our genetic makeup, just like marriage is built within us. Human beings, we have in us an innate desire for sexual union, because that's how we procreate. That's how we multiply on earth. It is inbuilt. It's not something we learn. It's inbuilt. The same with leadership. It's also inbuilt. Freedom is also inbuilt. That free enterprise is also inbuilt. We are created in God's image. God is a creator. We create. God is innovative. We innovate. So all these things that are inbuilt, they are created by God within. So any government which promotes them, any government which ensures that people's creativity comes out, people's individuality comes out, that government will be blessed of God, but also that nation will become a great nation, because it gives everybody opportunity to grow, to expand, to transform, and so society in general gets transformed. So for that reason, we pray and support America. Their weaknesses notwithstanding, they have weaknesses as a nation, but in general, we support the cause. Then the other major issue also about America is their support for Israel. In God's plan, Israel occupies a very, very important position, especially in the end times, because his firstborn nation is Israel. He is the firstborn nation, and the other nations then follow. So before America rose to power, Britain was greatly used by God in the first two world wars. The first two world war, God used Britain to defeat the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire occupied the Middle East, including Egypt. Just before the turn of the century, through a receivership, Ottoman Empire got into debt, and so they ended up having to surrender Egypt to Britain because they had landed into debts. But still, the Ottoman Empire was still holding on to the Middle East. So when the First World War started, the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany. Now that led Britain to be at loggerheads with the Ottoman Empire. They start to fight. And then in November 1917, the Ottoman Empire was defeated. That was a very, very, very important landmark, because when the Ottomans were defeated, they left the Middle East and Britain took over. Among the nations that were taken over was Israel. So now they made a Balfour Declaration as a nation, as Britain, that they supported the reinstatement of a state called Israel in the Middle East. Balfour was the prime minister who made that declaration, and so it's called Balfour Declaration. And that was a turning point in the history of the world, because Israel is the clock. It's God's prophetic clock in his dealings with nations. And so the Israelites, the Jews, were invited to come back from all over the world, wherever they were, to go back to their land. But the Jews were very successful in Europe. They were very successful in America. They didn't think there was any need for them to go back there. So even after the First World War had been won by Britain, and Britain was very supportive of their homeland being established as a new nation state, they still did. They were not yet a state after the First World War, but they were being invited to come back. And so, since they were successful in banking, in business, in the whole of Europe, for the next 30 years, there wasn't very much that was accomplished in them coming back. But God had said in his word through Ezekiel and Jeremiah that although the Jews were scattered all over the world, that he would bring them back to their nation, that he would do it in two phases, that the first phase would be the one of fishermen. A fisherman or a fisherman uses a bait to get a fish. You put an insect on the bait and the fish comes, and then you pull it. So he said that would be the first one. But then he said he'll use the second phase, which will be the hunter. And he says in Jeremiah, from 16 to 18, he's explaining that process. He says they will be hunted on all mountains, in all valleys, until they come back to their land. The hunter phase was the Second World War, in which war Hitler, filled with the demons, filled with Satan himself, had a perfect hatred for the Jews, and he hunted them in valleys, on mountains, and killed 6 million of them. Out of the 18 million Jews, 6, that is a third, was exterminated. And so they all woke up and realized we need a home of our own, otherwise we cannot be safe anywhere. We will still be killed anytime. We need to be in a nation of our own in which we can protect ourselves. And that is how, after the Second World War, everybody was unanimous that Israel needed a land of their own. These Jews need a land of their own. And God used America. That's how the change took place. It was like at first, Britain was leading as long as they had those interests. But as soon as they dropped their interests. They even started working against that new state. Prime Minister Churchill went behind his own words and cancelled with the pen what UN had, the mandate they had given them, and then worked against the same cause for which God had blessed Britain. That was a very, very big thing. Politically, that's why we are required to pray for leaders, because you make one mistake as a leader and you affect the whole of your nation. Some of the things may look minor, but to God, they are not minor. They are really major. There are things God can wink at. They're small, but there are others which are big. One of such issues which are big is that issue of Israel. It's not a minor issue to God, because it is part and parcel of his prophetic clock, especially in the last days. If he's working to restore Israel and you work against that, you suffer the consequences. It's a big thing. The whole nation, the whole of Britain suffered because of that action. Although God had used Churchill greatly to stand as a bulwark against the advancement of Nazis, yet by that simple mistake, he caused his nation to suffer. And so, in the Second World War, in his meeting with Roosevelt, who was the president of the United States of America in the Canadian waters in 1941 in August, there was a big meeting, a secret meeting, in which Churchill was insisting that America should join the war. And America said, no, we don't want. Roosevelt said, we don't want to join the war. You Europeans keep fighting for nothing, for no good reason. In the last World War, 9 million people were killed. Now you have started another one. We do not want to be part of that war. My people do not want to join that war. It's a senseless war. And in any case, why should we join? What's the difference between you, Churchill, and Hitler? Hitler is seeking to colonize you. He has taken over France. He has taken over he's taking over Poland and all these countries, and they're expanding their empire. But what's the difference? You are also doing the same. All over the world, you have conquered India, you've conquered Africa, you've conquered, and that we don't see any difference. You are all conquering to get your own territory. So when you defeat, if we come in and join you to beat Hitler, what are you going to do with Germany? What are you going to do with all those territories or colonies he controls? Are you going to annex them? And so that was a big discussion. There were 11 meetings that took place in that same time. They kept meeting, and Roosevelt said, I cannot, my people are totally against this war. And then Churchill had to admit, he said, okay, I see what you are saying. He said, okay, if you are ready to release these colonies after the war, so that every nation will be given freedom to, and then you not continue to control them. They'll be given independence, freedom for self-determination. Then I can convince the American people that this is a just war. America had always believed in the just war theory. Just war means you can get involved in a war which is just. So I can convince them that we're joining in so that we stop imperialism. And then the nations can be free. And so in that meeting, 8 points were agreed upon. And Churchill promised he was going to go back and consult the parliament on those 8 points. But major 2 issues were nations should be free. All nations should be free for self-determination, independent. The second is that Britain will not continue to control all the world trade, because at that time they controlled all trade between nations in the oceans and so on. And then there are others, but those two were major. I said, well, we had already started on that 10 years earlier. That was in 1931, when we passed the Statute of Westminster. So we passed it and allowed New Zealand to be free, and we allowed Canada to be free. Australia is going to follow suit, South Africa. So Churchill said, well, let me go back. And he wasn't, of course, happy, because being an imperial prime minister, you're supposed to continue expanding your empire. But now that he's disappointed, Roosevelt has refused. And yet he needs America at that time desperately, because otherwise the Germans were going to defeat them. So now he has to succumb to the pressure and give in, so that America can come and join the war to save them, to save their face. Now, that was in August. And those 8 points, of course, he took them to the House of Commons. They had to debate, and they had no choice but to accept. Fortunately for Churchill, in December that year, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and hit America, attacked America. America had not joined the war, but the Japanese attacked them. Now, that attack now sparked caused America to immediately now has a reason to join the war. And of course, Churchill was more than happy. But that meeting, that meeting that I've just mentioned was so important. I'm just bringing out issues that are important before God, which cause great blessings on nations. So many of our nations, all of Africa and Asia, many of the nations that were under the European imperial power were freed after that meeting. In 1947, India became free, got her independence. Later on in the 50s, and then Ghana got her independence. Then we also got ours in 1962. Kenya got in 1963. Tanzania got in 61. So many nations now got their freedom following that meeting. That meeting was recorded by Roosevelt's son, and he said, I saw my father forcing Churchill to cause the disintegration of the British Empire. Now, to God, that's an important thing, because empire is a pagan idea, while nation is the moral idea. It is what God intends. Empires are a recipe for wars, because you always want to expand your territory. In an empire, people are not free. People are subjects in an empire. In an empire, you're a subject. In a nation, you're a citizen. They're different. The people is what God is interested in. The people within are God's main interest. So in an empire, people are turned into subjects to the leaders. When you have an empire, you continually expand the territory, you fight. That's what Nimrod was building in Genesis 11, where he's building an empire. In an empire, when people pay taxes, they have no right to suggest how taxes are being used. They can be used to emperor's glory by building his statue, or by doing whatever they want. You don't have a parliament in an empire. That's why Britain was confused. It was between both an empire and then trying to be a nation and trying to be empire at the same time. But in the empire, people are subjects. They live for the purpose of the king or the emperor. While in a nation, you are a citizen. Citizens have rights. Citizens have privileges. Citizens have opportunities. Equal opportunity to become member of parliament, equal opportunity to become president. You can stand in an area and you'll be voted in as prime minister. That's the difference. You have a right to exist. You have a right to property, right to freedoms of expression, freedom of worship, freedom of speech, freedom of association. That's the difference. So citizens have those rights, but they also have duties, responsibilities, and obligations. So in a nation, people, God is interested in people. People can be developed, they grow, they become transformed because of how the nation is built. Morally, it gives freedom to all people to express themselves, to innovate, to create. They have opportunities of business. They can marry whomever they want. They can start a business wherever they want. They can also relate with other nations by trade, free enterprise, nation between nation and nation. In a nation, you don't covet your neighbor's territory. In a nation, you trade with others. God told the children of Israel when they were entering the promised land, don't touch that one, don't touch that one. I've given that land to the sons of Esau, so don't touch it. On this side, when you pass through their land, you pay for everything you eat, food, water, pay for it. Don't fight them because I've given them their land. So when the children of Israel were entering the promised land, where the giants were, they were not proper people. So go in and destroy them. But the Edomites don't destroy them. I've given them that land. So you can see he was not only interested in Israel occupying their land, he was also interested in these other nations. So when you read Deuteronomy, chapters 1 and 2 and 3, you'll see those nations, which was not the nation of giants. The giants were not proper human beings. They were a mix of foreign angels and human beings. But the other people who were normal, like the Edomites, the Edomites were descendants of Esau. So God said, don't touch them. I've given them their land. That land is theirs. I'll not give you 1 inch of them. Then the Moabites, they were descendants of Lot, Ammonites. So he says, don't touch them because I have given them their land. So in a nation, every a citizen knows that this is our land, this is where we start and this is where we end. We can only trade with other nations, but we don't covet their territory. We don't fight them. So nation is recipe for peace, while empire is recipe for war. That's why wars continued in Europe, because Europe, having been under the Roman Catholic theology, the Roman Catholic theology flows from the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire disintegrated in 476, the church at that time took over, led by the popes. The popes had a belief that they called it the donation of Constantine, that Constantine bequeathed to the church the authority that he had, meaning that now the church became the Holy Roman Empire, Christendom, Christ's kingdom. So they interpreted that authority of the Pope as Christ's kingdom on earth. So from that moment, the Roman Catholic Church adopted the theology of an empire. An empire meaning that now they have to conquer the whole world using the popes and the emperors. That's why emperors and the popes were always fighting, because both had adopted this pagan idea. Pagan ideas entered into the church when the church lost its moral compass, not only in the areas of worship, like worshiping Mary, not only in other areas like indulgences, which made the church very corrupt, not only corrupting the whole issue of marriage, that the priests don't marry. There are many, many other pagan ideas that entered the church at that time. major of which is that theology of empire rather than a nation. So the Roman Catholic Church adopted the empire model, which is a pagan idea, and then the church supported it. So for all those centuries, the Roman Catholic Church supported the issue of empire. Now, during the Reformation did not only break down the theological issue of faith for an individual to be saved, but it also broke that spirit, that pagan issue of empire. That's why there were so many wars. When the Reformation started, the nations that had been subjugated, when they read the Bible and realized we are supposed to be a nation, we're not supposed to be under other people ruling over us. For example, the Dutch in Holland, for 75 years, they were fighting to be free from the Spanish Empire, which called itself the Holy Roman Empire. It was neither holy nor Roman, but they said, why should we be under the Spanish when we have read and understood the scriptures? Why should we be under other nations ruling over us? So that fight ended with a first modern nation, two first modern nations. One is Switzerland, another one is Holland, in 1648, after the 30-year war, 30 years war. For 30 years, that war was going on and ravaged the whole of Europe. 1618 to 1648, call it the 30 years war. But the Dutch had started much earlier. So in that year, in 1648, what today is called a nation comes to prominence, and for the first time it is recognized in Europe that nations should be free. Every nation should have freedom to exist independently with its leadership, with its culture, language, everything. So this was God not only restoring the truth of personal salvation, personal relationship with God, but also it affected the whole issue of leadership. Political leadership was affected by the Reformation. So it did not only reform the church, it also reformed the politics. Now, fast forward to the Second World War, which I'm now making comment on about America. Why we pray for America at the moment is because now they having broken off from the imperial bondage of Britain and started to be a nation in 1776. They started to espouse those beliefs, the Protestant belief of a nation, that nations should be free. God created nations, he did not create empires. Nimrod wanted an empire. God demolished that empire in Genesis 11 in order to free the nations, the 70 nations that are listed in Genesis 10. They are freed to be free to live by themselves. And in Acts chapter 17, verse 26, Paul reiterates that same truth and says, God is the one who had this idea of nations. He created them and gave them boundaries so that perhaps they may seek him and find him, although he's not very far from all of us. Now, we were speaking to the Greeks in Athens. The Greeks did not have the concept of a nation. They only had city-states. During the time of Socrates and others, they never understood the concept of nations. So through all that period, that issue of nation had not been developed. So America becomes the first nation in the modern world to promote the idea of this, of nation. Although it started with Switzerland and Holland as the first modern nation, America learned it from the Dutch. The Dutch influenced, for example, there's a man called Grotius. He's credited as the father of modern international relations, but he's the one who taught John Locke. John Locke was a son of a British minister, preacher who ran away from Britain and lived in Holland for a long time. And then he learned a lot of theories, biblical theories about the nation. So he went back to Britain after a revolution, and he wrote about a nation, about these rights. Later on, the American founders, when they were fighting for their independence, they kept quoting John Locke, but John Locke had been discipled in Holland. So Holland and Switzerland were the first modern nations, after which God now used America to promote this issue. That's why after the war, the Second World War, we don't see United Empires, but United Nations. So for the nation comes in the prominency right after that war. God does not bring wars. It is people who fight these wars. Human beings and devil wants wars, but God allows many of these wars, especially if he can have his cause. He can still have his way in the midst of human error, human greed, human mistakes. God can still have his way. So we see God using America now to bring the issue of independence, the issue of self-determination of every nation to prominence. So we owe, all of us, whether we like it or not, especially here in Africa, we have our freedom as independent nations to that meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill. Although it wasn't signed, those 8 points were not signed at that time, but later on they were signed when the United Nations was formed to release nations. And from that moment now, everybody was to recognize that these nations should be independent, should be free. When ideas align with God's word, nations are blessed, but also the proponents of them are also blessed. So a nation like America now got very blessed. That's why from that moment, America was really growing very, very fast, became very wealthy, because also it joined the wallet, but also it was the one selling food to most of Europe. Not only that, after the war, they came up with a plan to rebuild Europe. That plan, that master plan that they came up with, they invested a lot in rebuilding Germany, in rebuilding these nations that had been ravaged by war. That was that Marshall Plan was a very, very godly principle. When you build nations, when you support nations, when you bless nations, you are also blessed. So that's how America becomes a very blessed nation, and becomes a blessing to many nations. God's plan and promise was always, you'll be blessed and be a blessing to many nations. And so that is God's idea for every nation, including us here. Now, finally, when a nation stands for righteousness, God honors that nation. But specifically, normally, it is individuals who do that. If you look at the nation of Israel and their history, there were kings who were godly, there were others who were not. The kings who were godly in Judah, they had 8 kings who were godly, the other 12 were not. The 12 kings who were wicked always caused the nation to digress, retrogress, while the ones who were godly, the 8 who brought reformation in their nations or revivals, they always caused the nations to be blessed. So the people, the kings themselves, were greatly blessed by God by doing that. So God always blessed individuals For example, we all know David was a godly man, so he caused the blessing. His son Solomon at first was okay, but later on backslid. But during those two times, Israel almost became what kind of a nation God really wanted, because they are greatly beloved. But following that, the nation was divided into two, between northern Israel and southern Judah. Southern Judah had 20 kings, northern Israel had 19 kings. All the 19 were wrong, were wicked. But out of the 20 Judean kings, 8 of them were godly. And so you see, every time any of these 8 would bring a revival, there would be a great blessing and prosperity. In the north, where all the kings were evil, total evil continued to reign. God's patience ran out in 722 BC, when the Assyrians came and wiped out the northern tribe, because the godly Jews migrated to the south, and so all the wicked remained in the north. Once, after Ahab, a king called Jehu arose. Jehu arose and destroyed Baal worship, following the prophecy that Elijah had given. Jehu destroyed Baal worship, and God was so happy. He said, I'm going to give you rain for the next 3 generations after you. So Jehu alone and his family ruled for 104 years, just because he made a stand against Baal worship in Israel. He was not godly himself. In fact, he himself ended up being an idolater. But just because he took a stand against Jezebel, he killed Jezebel, he killed and wiped out the house of Ahab to fulfill the word of the Lord. Because of that, God greatly, greatly blessed him and said, you rule for the next 4 generations. So his sons continued ruling, and his grandson, for 4 generations, that nation was under that man, Jehu. Now, that is a principle that is important to see, especially when we come to the issue of America now. For us as believers, the main intention of our prayer is that we identify where God's interests are and we support that. Otherwise, you end up praying contrary to his. That's why we spend time to read the word, to study the word here, to discuss it, so that we don't pray amiss. For example, I find people in America, especially our brothers and sisters who are African Americans, for them, it's like blacks against whites. But that's not the criteria of choosing how you pray. In politics, you pray for what God's interests are. What does God want? You find many Ugandans are anti-Trump. And when I go there, I many times have debates with them. They were anti. I told them, look, in the first term of Trump, God brought him purpose and called him Cyrus. He used, he spoke to many believers long before he came, and he said he's going to be like a Cyrus. In Isaiah 45, Cyrus does not know God, but God is going to use him to do ABCD in Isaiah 45. Daniel kept very close to Cyrus, and he told him what to do and what God wanted, and Cyrus fulfilled the purposes of God. That's important. In Jeremiah's time, Jeremiah had a problem. Believers, the Jews, did not embrace Nebuchadnezzar. Yet Nebuchadnezzar was God's instrument at that time. God said, my servant Nebuchadnezzar. In chapter 27 of Jeremiah, God is telling Jeremiah to tell the Jews, don't resist Jeremiah, don't resist Nebuchadnezzar. He's my servant. He has a purpose to fulfill. So the Jews refused, and many of those who refused suffered God's judgment at that time. Why? because they were going contrary to what God's purposes are. Our role as believers is not to pray for what we want. We are to pray for what he wants. We know, we understand what he wants, and then we pray accordingly. That's how we help our nations. We can only be prophets to the degree that we are aligned with God's purposes. Jeremiah is a God's prophet, and God told him, you root out, you pull down, you throw down, you destroy, and I've put nations in your hands. Now, he didn't have an army. Jeremiah didn't have an army to do those things, but he did it through his prayers, through his prophetic word. When he spoke, the kings that rebelled against him suffered. For example, Zedekiah. Zedekiah rebelled against Jeremiah because every time Jeremiah told him something, the other prophets confused them. We have so many confusing prophets in our day. Prophets who are just prophesying what they want. They speak in the name of God when God has not said. So Jeremiah's biggest problem wasn't the king Zedekiah. It was these other false prophets who pretended to be speaking in the name of the Lord when they were not. God is saying one thing and they're saying another. That is the problem we have today. When the prophets of God are divided, the church of Christ is divided, the interests are divided. They're not according to God's will, but according to their fleshly desires. Instead of saying, what does God want? They say what they want. That is something that we have to guard against. Otherwise, you are disqualified. So they ended up confusing Zedekiah. He listened to them because what they were saying was more palatable than what Jeremiah was saying. And so he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar came, destroyed the city. Zedekiah was escaping and his family, and he was arrested. The last thing that Zedekiah last saw with his eyes was when all his children were slaughtered before his eyes in the face of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar made sure they are all arrested and they are all killed before his eyes. And once they were killed, then his eyes were also removed. And so he was taken as a prisoner to Babylon, where he died in prison. So you can see how that king ended very, very badly. Looking at all your children being slaughtered alive because of your rebellion. All your family being slaughtered before you because of your rebellion. And then your eyes are removed, and then you are taken in chains. And then he ended up in Babylon as a prisoner, and he died there. So this is something that we need to do, understand as intercessors. That's why we take time to read. That's why we take time to pray. To study, because first of all, if you don't study history, you keep repeating it. But then number two, my people are destroyed because of lack of knowledge. We should have knowledge of God's word, God's major interests in issues. What is God's main interest? Our interest may be different from his, including in our nation here. What we value is not necessarily what God values for most of the people. When you look at our politics, our interpretations many times are different from those of God. And so you may end up praying contrary to his will, because what he values and takes more important, for him, those take precedence over human interests and human interpretations. Thank you.